The whispers started the moment Grace Vaughn stepped off the stagecoach in Delta, Colorado, her belly swollen beneath her worn traveling dress, and no wedding band catching the harsh August sunlight of 1882. She clutched her carpetbag with trembling fingers as a dozen pairs of eyes turned toward her, conversations dying mid-sentence, judgment spreading like wildfire across the dusty street. The driver practically threw her trunk to the ground, eager to be rid of the scandalous cargo, and Grace stood alone in the center of town, feeling every condemning stare pierce through her like arrows. She had come west with nothing but desperate hope, and the address of a distant aunt who had promised work at her boarding house. But even Aunt Margaret's expression turned cold when she saw Grace's condition. The older woman stood in the doorway of the two-story establishment, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line that spoke volumes before a single word left her mouth. "Grace Vaughn, your mother wrote that you needed a fresh start, but she did not mention this particular circumstance," Margaret said, her voice clipped and disapproving. "I run a respectable establishment. What will my boarders think?" "Please, Aunt Margaret," Grace pleaded, exhaustion making her voice shake. "I have nowhere else to go. I can work harder than anyone. I will stay out of sight. I will do anything." Margaret's jaw worked as she considered, her gaze darting to the neighbors already gathering on their porches to witness the spectacle. Finally, she stepped aside with a heavy sigh. "You will work in the kitchen and laundry. You will not serve the dining room or interact with guests. And you will attend church every Sunday to show this town you seek redemption." Grace nodded quickly, relief flooding through her despite the harsh terms. She had expected nothing better. She had learned in the past 6 months that a woman in her position could expect nothing but shame and closed doors. The boarding house kitchen became her prison and sanctuary both. She woke before dawn to stoke the fires, spent her days scrubbing floors and boiling laundry until her hands were raw, and collapsed into her tiny attic room long after dark. The other women who worked at the boarding house kept their distance, their polite coldness more cutting than outright cruelty would have been. Sunday arrived with its own special torment. Grace dressed in her best dress, which no longer buttoned properly, and made the walk to the small church at the edge of town. Every step felt like walking to her own execution. She could feel the weight of judgment before she even entered, and when she stepped through the door, the congregation fell silent. Women pulled their children closer. Men looked away. The only empty space was in the very back pew, isolated from the rest of the community like a leper. Grace sat alone, her hands folded over her belly, trying to focus on the Reverend's words about forgiveness and grace, the bitter irony of her own name not lost on her. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to let them see her cry, but each whispered comment cut deep. Shameful. No husband. What kind of woman? She was halfway through the service when she felt it, a sensation different from the condemning stares she had grown accustomed to. This gaze was steady, curious rather than cruel. Grace risked a glance to her left and found a man watching her from across the aisle. He sat apart from the main congregation as well, though for different reasons. His sun-bronzed face bore the marks of a life spent outdoors, and his simple but clean clothing marked him as a working cowboy rather than a ranch owner. When their eyes met, he did not look away in disgust. Instead, he nodded slightly, a gesture so small and yet so unexpected that Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. After the service, Grace tried to slip out quickly, but the cowboy was waiting near the door. Up close, she could see he was young, probably not more than 25, with dark hair and gray eyes that held a surprising gentleness. "Madam," he said, removing his hat. "I am Connor Fairbanks. I work at the Running River Ranch just outside town. Grace glanced around nervously, aware that several church members were watching this exchange with great interest. "Mr. Fairbanks," she acknowledged quietly, preparing to move past him. "I could not help but notice you are new to Delta," he continued, falling into step beside her as she walked. "It can be a hard place for newcomers." "I am managing," Grace said, though her voice betrayed the lie. Connor was quiet for a moment, his boots crunching in the dirt road. "My mother died when I was 12, he said suddenly. "People in our town blamed my father, said he worked her to death. They whispered about us for years. I know something about how cruel gossip can be." Grace stopped walking, turning to face him properly for the first time. In his eyes she saw genuine understanding, not pity. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I see how they look at you, and I want you to know that not everyone in this town is so quick to judge," Connor said simply. "And because I thought you might like to know that at least one person sees you as a human being deserving of basic kindness." Tears sprang to Grace's eyes before she could stop them. She had not realized how starved she had been for even this small measure of compassion. "Thank you," she whispered. From that day forward, Connor Fairbanks made it his mission to show Grace Vaughn that she was not alone. He began appearing at the boarding house's back door on Sunday afternoons with fresh vegetables from the ranch, always polite, always respectful of propriety. He would sit on the back steps while Grace shelled peas or hung laundry, and they would talk about everything and nothing. She learned that he had been working at the Running River Ranch since he was 16, that he was saving money to buy his own land someday, that he had a gift with horses that made him invaluable despite his young age of 24. In turn, she told him her story, the truth she had told no one else in Delta. She had been engaged to a man back in Pennsylvania, a merchant's son who had promised her the world. They had anticipated their wedding vows, and when she discovered she was with child, he had disappeared rather than face his responsibilities. Her family, mortified by the scandal, had sent her west to spare themselves the shame. Connor listened without judgment, his expression growing darker only when she spoke of the man who had abandoned her. "He was a coward," he said flatly. "A real man does not run from his responsibilities. A real man protects what is his." "I am not his," Grace said softly. "I never really was." "I see that now." "No," Connor agreed, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You deserve better than that." As autumn painted the Colorado landscape in gold and crimson, Grace's belly grew rounder and the whispers grew louder. Women crossed the street to avoid passing her. Shopkeepers served her last and with obvious reluctance. Even Aunt Margaret grew more distant, making it clear that once the baby came, Grace would need to find other arrangements. Grace tried not to let the fear consume her, but late at night in her attic room, she would lie awake wondering how she would survive with an infant and no means of support. No one would hire her. No one would rent to her. She had no money to return east even if she wanted to face that humiliation. The future stretched before her like a vast, dark canyon with no bridge across. Connor noticed the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. One Sunday in late October, he arrived with his usual vegetables, but also with a determination in his expression that Grace had not seen before. "Walk with me," he said. "Please. I need to speak with you properly." Grace glanced back at the boarding house, but Aunt Margaret had gone to visit friends, and the other workers were busy with their own concerns. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and followed Connor down the road toward the edge of town, where the land opened up into rolling hills painted gold by the setting sun. They walked in silence until they reached a small rise overlooking the valley. Connor stopped there, turning to face her with his hat in his hands, working the brim nervously between his fingers. "Grace," "I am not a man of pretty words or fancy promises," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I am just a cowboy with more dreams than dollars and a future that is uncertain at best. But I am a man who keeps his word, and I am a man who knows right from wrong." Grace's heart began to pound. "Connor, what are you saying?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. Nothing fancy, but solid and real in the fading light. "I am saying that I have watched you face this town's cruelty with more dignity and strength than most men I know could muster. I have listened to you talk about your hopes and fears, and I have come to care for you more than I ever thought possible. I know this is sudden. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I cannot stand by and watch you suffer when I have the power to stop it. Connor." Grace breathed, unable to believe what she was hearing. He stepped closer, his gray eyes searching hers with desperate sincerity. "Marry me, Grace. Wear my ring and stop their whispers. Give your baby my name. Let me be the man who stands beside you and protects you the way you should have been protected from the start." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were not tears of despair. "You do not have to do this. You do not owe me anything. This child is not yours. The child will be mine if you say yes," Connor said firmly. "From the moment we speak our vows, that baby will be mine in every way that matters. I will raise him or her as my own, love him or her as my own. And you, Grace Vaughn, will be my wife, my partner, my family. If you will have me." Grace looked at this man who was offering her everything when he had no obligation to offer her anything at all. She searched his face for any sign of pity or martyrdom, and found only honest affection and fierce determination. In the past months, she had come to look forward to his visits, to treasure their conversations, to feel safe in his presence. She had been so focused on survival that she had not let herself acknowledge the warmth that bloomed in her chest whenever he smiled at her. But now, with his proposal hanging in the air between them, she could no longer deny it. "I care for you too," she whispered. "More than I should, perhaps, given how complicated everything is. But Connor, marriage is forever. You are young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Are you certain you want to tie yourself to a woman already carrying another man's child?" Connor closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "I am more certain of this than I have ever been of anything. Grace, I have been alone most of my life. I have worked hard and saved my money and told myself that someday I would have a family of my own. But family is not just about blood. It is about choosing to stand together, about building something good out of whatever circumstances life hands you. Say yes. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." Grace felt something break open inside her, all the fear and shame and loneliness of the past months cracking apart to let in light. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I will marry you, Connor Fairbanks." He slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her carefully, mindfully of her condition, but with a strength that made her feel, for the first time since this whole ordeal began, truly safe. They were married 3 days later by the justice of the peace, with only the required witnesses present. Grace wore her best dress, altered to accommodate her belly, and carried wildflowers that Connor had picked that morning. When the justice pronounced them man and wife, Connor kissed her gently, reverently, as though she were something precious rather than something shameful. The reaction in Delta was mixed. Some people were scandalized that Connor would marry such a woman. Others grudgingly approved, seeing it as Grace finally doing the right thing, even if the timing was less than ideal. But regardless of their opinions, no one could deny the legitimacy of the marriage or question the baby's status once it was born. Connor moved Grace out of the boarding house, and into a small cabin on the edge of the Running River Ranch. The ranch owner, a gruff but fair man named Thomas Brennan, had given Connor permission to live on the property as part of his employment. The cabin was simple, just 2 rooms and a loft, but Grace had never loved a place more. It was theirs, a home where she did not have to hide or apologize for her existence. Connor proved to be everything he had promised and more. He worked long hours at the ranch, but always came home with a smile for Grace, asking about her day, helping with chores despite his exhaustion. He repaired the cabin's roof, built a proper bed frame to replace the old rope cot, and constructed a cradle from pine wood that he sanded smooth and carved with simple flowers. As November turned to December, and Grace's time drew near, Connor's protectiveness intensified. He worried constantly about her health, about the birth, about whether he would be a good father. Grace found his concern endearing, this strong cowboy who could break wild horses but fretted over whether he had stacked enough firewood or stocked enough food. "I am tougher than I look," Grace assured him one evening as they sat by the fire, her feet propped up to ease the swelling. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my woman," Connor said seriously. "Not my baby, this is different." Grace felt warmth spread through her at his words. He truly meant it. In his mind, this child was already his, regardless of biology. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said softly. Connor looked at her with such love that it took her breath away. "And you are already a wonderful mother. The way you sing to the baby, the way you talk to him while you work, he is lucky to have you." "Her," Grace teased. "I am convinced it is a girl." "Then she is lucky to have you," Connor amended with a smile. He reached out to place his hand on her belly, marveling as always when the baby moved beneath his palm. "Hello in there, little one. This is your pa talking. I cannot wait to meet you." The baby arrived on a snowy night in mid-December, coming faster than anyone expected. Connor rode through the blizzard to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Iris, who had delivered half the babies in the county. Grace labored through the long night with Connor holding her hand, whispering encouragement, refusing to leave her side despite the midwife's suggestion that he wait outside as most men did. "I am staying with my wife," Connor said firmly, and Grace loved him even more for it. As dawn broke pink and gold over the snow-covered landscape, Grace brought her daughter into the world with a final, agonizing push. The baby's first cry was the most beautiful sound Grace had ever heard, and when the midwife placed the tiny, perfect infant in her arms, Grace wept with relief and joy and overwhelming love. But it was Connor's reaction that she would remember forever. He looked at the baby with such wonder, such immediate and fierce devotion, that no one could ever doubt she was his. He touched her tiny hand with one calloused finger, and when she gripped it reflexively, his eyes filled with tears. "She is perfect," he whispered. "Grace, she is absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Grace asked, though exhaustion weighed heavy on her. Connor looked up, his expression serious. "You should choose. You are her mother." Grace shook her head. "We are her parents, we choose together." They decided on Catherine Rose, and Connor registered the birth at the town office himself, proudly declaring himself the father. If anyone suspected the truth about the timing, they kept it to themselves. Catherine bore the Fairbanks name, and that was what mattered. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Catherine was a hungry baby who woke frequently in the night, and Grace often found herself stumbling through her days in a fog of sleeplessness. But Connor was a partner in every sense, walking the floor with Catherine when she fussed, changing her cloths without complaint, singing off-key lullabies that somehow always soothed her. Grace watched her husband fall more in love with their daughter every day, and in the process, she found herself falling deeper in love with him. The marriage that had begun as a practical solution to her desperate circumstances was transforming into something real and profound. One February evening, after they had finally gotten Catherine to sleep and were sitting together by the fire, Connor pulled Grace close against his side. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Grace considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she had been alone and terrified, facing a future of shame and poverty. Now she had a home, a husband who loved her, and a healthy baby daughter. The whispers in town had not completely stopped, but they had faded to background noise that she could mostly ignore. More importantly, she did not need the approval of people who had been so quick to judge her. "Yes," she said, turning to look at Connor. "I am happier than I ever thought possible. You gave me that. You gave me everything." Connor cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You gave me everything too. A family, a purpose, someone to love who loves me back." He kissed her then, not the chaste kisses of their early marriage, but with passion and desire that had been building for months. Grace responded in kind, her body awakening to needs she had thought buried under the exhaustion of new motherhood. They came together that night as true husband and wife, not just in name but in every sense, and Grace finally felt complete. Spring arrived with a rush of green across the Colorado landscape, and with it came new opportunities. Thomas Brennan announced that he was selling off parcels of his ranch land to settlers, and he offered Connor first choice on a section that bordered the river. The price was fair, and Connor had saved most of his wages over the years he had worked at the ranch. It was enough for a down payment, with the rest to be paid over time. "We could have our own place," Connor told Grace excitedly. "Not just a cabin we live in by permission, but real land that belongs to us. I could run cattle, breed horses. We could build a proper house as the money comes in." Grace saw the dream shining in his eyes and knew that she would support him in anything. "Then we should do it. The 4 of us will build something together." 4. Connor looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned. "Grace, are you?" She nodded, her hand moving to her still flat belly. "I am fairly certain. I have felt this way before." Connor let out a whoop of joy that woke Catherine from her nap, but he did not care. He swept Grace into his arms, spinning her carefully, his face split by the widest smile she had ever seen. "We are having a baby, our baby," Grace laughed, giddy with his happiness. "All our babies are our babies, Connor. You know what I mean," he said, but then he sobered slightly, looking serious. "Not that it makes any difference. Catherine is mine just as much as this one will be, just as much as any others we might have." "I know," Grace said, touching his face. "You prove it every single day. You are the best father, the best husband. I love you, Connor Fairbanks." "I love you too," he said, kissing her soundly, "more than I ever knew was possible." They bought the land and began the hard work of building their future. Connor worked from sunup to sundown, breaking ground, mending fences, and constructing a small barn while still fulfilling his obligations to Thomas Brennan. Grace did what she could despite her growing belly, planting a vegetable garden, tending chickens they had purchased, and caring for Catherine, who was growing faster than seemed possible. The work was backbreaking, but they faced it together, and that made all the difference. On Sundays, they would rest, attending church as a family. Grace noticed that the cold stares had warmed somewhat. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now nodded in greeting. Some even stopped to admire Catherine or offer advice about children. The change was not universal. There were still those who looked down their noses at Grace, who whispered about her past. But Grace found that she no longer cared. She had Connor's love, Catherine's laughter, a baby on the way, and a future to build. What did she need with the approval of small-minded people? In September, on a warm afternoon filled with the gold light of late summer, Grace gave birth to a son they named Samuel Connor. The birth was easier than Catherine's had been, and the baby was healthy and strong, with Connor's gray eyes and a shock of dark hair. Connor held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Thank you," he whispered to Grace. "Thank you for this gift, for this life, for choosing me." Grace smiled tiredly. "Thank you for giving me a chance when no one else would. Thank you for loving me, for loving Catherine, for building this beautiful life with me." With 2 children and a ranch to run, their lives became a whirlwind of constant motion. Grace learned to cook for her growing family, to preserve vegetables for winter, to churn butter and bake bread. Connor proved to have a gift for animal husbandry, and his small herd grew steadily. He bought a breeding mare and began training horses, a sideline that brought an extra income. Catherine grew into a bright, curious toddler who followed her father everywhere, and Samuel was a happy baby who seemed content as long as he could see his family. Grace would often pause in her work to watch Connor with the children, marveling at how natural he was with them, how patient and kind. He was teaching Catherine her letters and numbers, singing silly songs to make Samuel laugh, and including them in age-appropriate ranch work, so they would grow up understanding the value of effort. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over their land, Catherine asleep against Connor's shoulder and Samuel nursing at Grace's breast, Connor said, "Do you ever think about telling her?" Grace did not need to ask what he meant. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But what would I say? The man who gave her life abandoned us, but the man who raised her loved her from the start. She has you. She has a father who treasures her. Why confuse her with information that does not change anything?" Connor nodded slowly. "I worry sometimes that she will find out from someone in town. That someone will be cruel and tell her she is not really mine. Then we will deal with it together," Grace said firmly. "But Connor, in every way that matters, she is yours. You were there when she was born. You walked the floor with her when she cried. You kissed her scraped knees and taught her to count. Biology does not make a father. Love makes a father." Connor's eyes were bright with emotion. "I could not love her more if she carried my blood. You know that, right?" "I know," Grace said, reaching out to take his hand. "And so will she. We will make sure she always knows she is loved, wanted, and cherished." The years rolled on, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growth of their family. When Catherine was 5 and Samuel was 3, Grace gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Alina, who kept everyone on their toes with their mischievous energy. 2 years later came another son, James, and finally, when Grace was 32 and Connor was 31, their youngest daughter, Margaret, named after Grace's aunt, who had softened over the years and become a doting grandmother figure. The ranch prospered. Connor's reputation as a horseman spread throughout the region, and buyers came from as far as Denver to purchase his trained stock. Grace's garden produced abundantly, and she sold preserves and baked goods in town, contributing to the family's growing prosperity. They built a proper house, a beautiful 2-story structure with a wide porch and enough bedrooms for their large family. Delta had changed too. The town that had once shunned Grace now respected her as a hard-working ranch wife and mother. She had proven herself through years of dedication to her family and community. She volunteered at the church, helped organize the annual Harvest Festival, and was known for being the first to arrive with food when a neighbor was sick or struggling. The whispers had long since stopped. Most people had either forgotten the circumstances of Grace's arrival or simply did not care anymore. A new generation had grown up knowing only that the Fairbanks family ran a successful ranch and raised good children. But Grace never forgot what Connor had done for her. On their 10th wedding anniversary, she gave him a gift she had been working on for months, a leather-bound journal filled with her memories of their life together. She had written about the day they met, his proposal on the hill overlooking the valley, the births of each of their children, and 1,000 small moments that had built their love into something unshakable. Connor read it by lamplight, his calloused fingers careful with the pages, and when he finished, he was crying. "Grace, this is the most precious thing anyone has ever given me. You gave me my life back," Grace said simply. "You gave me dignity when everyone else wanted to strip it from me. You gave me love when I thought I would never be worthy of it again. A journal does not begin to repay that debt." "There is no debt," Connor said fiercely, pulling her into his arms. "Loving you has never been a sacrifice. It has been the greatest privilege of my life. Every day I wake up grateful that I was in that church the day you arrived, grateful that I had the courage to speak to you, grateful that you said yes to my clumsy proposal." "It was not clumsy," Grace protested. "It was perfect. You offered me exactly what I needed when I needed it most." Connor kissed her deeply, the passion between them still as strong as it had been in those early days. "I would do it again in a heartbeat. I would do it 1,000 times over. You are my heart, Grace Fairbanks." As Grace moved into her middle years, she watched with pride as her children grew into fine young people. Catherine, her eldest, had her mother's gentle spirit and her father's determination. She was 17 now, beautiful and kind, and already courted by several young men in the area. Grace watched her daughter navigate the attention with a maturity that spoke to the secure foundation she had been given. One spring evening, Catherine approached her parents as they sat on the porch. The younger children were already in bed, and the ranch was quiet except for the songs of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "Mother, Father, I need to talk to you about something," Catherine said, her voice serious. Grace and Connor exchanged glances, immediately attentive. "Of course, sweetheart. Sit down." Catherine settled onto the porch steps, her hands twisting in her skirt. "I have been thinking about my future, about marriage. Thomas Mitchell has asked permission to court me formally." Connor's expression darkened slightly. Thomas was the son of a neighboring rancher, a decent enough young man, but Connor was not ready to think about his daughter courting anyone. "You are still young." "I am 17, Father. Mother was only 19 when she married you." "That was different," Connor said, but Catherine shook her head. "Was it? Mother needed help and you provided it. You built a life together based on respect and kindness, and love grew from that. I understand that now more than I did when I was younger." Grace felt her heart stutter. "What do you mean?" Catherine looked at them both with calm, knowing eyes. "I have known for a while that my birth came very soon after your marriage. I can count, Mother. I am not a child. And I have heard whispers over the years, though people tried to be discreet." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, all her old fears rushing back. "Catherine, But Catherine moved quickly, kneeling beside her mother and taking her hands. "Mother, do not cry. I am not upset. I am grateful. You both gave me a life filled with love and security. Father has never treated me as anything less than his cherished daughter. That is what matters. Not biology, not the circumstances of my conception, but the family we have built together." Connor cleared his throat roughly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You are my daughter, Catherine. You always have been, from the moment you drew your first breath. Nothing changes that." "I know," Catherine said, smiling at him with such love that Grace's heart ached. "That is what I am trying to tell you. I know what you did for Mother for me, and it makes me love you both even more. You taught me that family is not about blood. It is about choice, about showing up every day and choosing love. That is the kind of marriage I want to build with someone someday." Connor stood and pulled Catherine into a fierce embrace. "You are wise beyond your years. And yes, Thomas may court you, though I will be watching him very carefully to make sure he treats you with the respect you deserve." Catherine laughed through her tears. "I would expect nothing less." That night, after Catherine had gone to bed, Grace and Connor held each other close. "I was so afraid of her finding out," Grace whispered. "So afraid it would change how she saw us, how she saw herself." "But it did not," Connor said, stroking her hair. "We raised her to be strong and compassionate and secure in our love. She is exactly who we hoped she would be." Grace tilted her face up to kiss him. "Because of you, because you stepped in when someone else stepped away, because you chose us." "I chose love," Connor corrected, "and I have never regretted it for a single moment." The years continued to unfold in a tapestry of joy and challenge, triumph and hardship. Catherine married Thomas Mitchell in a beautiful ceremony on the ranch, and within 2 years, she made Grace and Connor grandparents. Samuel followed his father's path, becoming an expert horseman and taking over much of the training operation. The twins, Emma and Alina, proved to have sharp minds for business, helping Grace expand her preserve operation into a profitable venture that supplied stores throughout the region. James developed a passion for carpentry, building furniture that was sought after for its quality craftsmanship. Young Margaret, the baby of the family, showed signs of following in Catherine's nurturing footsteps. Grace and Connor aged together, their faces lined by sun and laughter, their bodies marked by years of hard work, but their love only deepened with time. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played, and marvel at the life they had built from such humble and desperate beginnings. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. The house was filled with laughter and music, grandchildren running underfoot, adult children telling stories and teasing each other. As Grace looked around at the faces she loved most in the world, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Connor found her in a quiet moment, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured against her ear. "I am thinking about that girl who stepped off the stagecoach 25 years ago, terrified and alone, certain that her life was over," Grace said softly. "I am thinking about the cowboy who saw past her shame and offered her hope. I am thinking about how one act of kindness, one decision to be brave, can change everything." Connor turned her in his arms so they faced each other. His hair was more silver than dark now, his face weathered, but his gray eyes still held the same gentle strength that had first drawn her to him. "I am thinking about how that terrified girl became the strongest woman I know. How she built a home and raised a family and became the heart of everything good in my life. I am thinking about how lucky I am that I was in that church the day you arrived." Grace cupped his face in her hands. "The luck was mine. You saved me, Connor, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Connor corrected. "You gave me purpose, gave me a family, gave me a reason to be more than just a drifting cowboy. We built this life together, Grace, every moment of it." They kissed there in the midst of their celebration, surrounded by the evidence of their love and commitment. Catherine caught sight of them and smiled, nudging her husband and pointing. Soon all their children and grandchildren were watching, and someone started to clap. Then they all were, applauding not just the anniversary but the love story that had beaten the odds and created something beautiful. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet, Grace and Connor returned to their porch, their traditional ending to every day. The Colorado sky was brilliant with stars, and the air was sweet with the scent of Grace's flower garden. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if I had not approached you that day?" Connor asked. Grace considered. "Sometimes. But then I remember that we cannot live in the world of what might have been. We can only live in what is. And what is more wonderful than I ever dared to dream." "Tell me what you see when you look at our life," Connor prompted, as he had so many times over the years. Grace smiled, knowing he loved to hear her perspective. "I see a ranch that we built with our own hands and hard work. I see children who grew up secure in the knowledge that they were loved and valued. I see grandchildren who will carry forward the values we tried to instill. I see a community that respects us, neighbors who have become friends. But most of all, I see a man who kept every promise he ever made to me, who loved me when I was unlovable, who stood beside me when everyone else stood against me." Connor's arms tightened around her. "You were never unlovable, Grace. You were scared and hurt and in an impossible situation. But you were always worthy of love." "I know that now," Grace said. "You taught me. Every day through your actions and your words, you taught me that I had value beyond my mistakes, that my worth was not determined by the judgment of people who did not know my heart." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, wrapped in each other and their memories. Finally, Connor spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "If I could go back and give that young cowboy advice, do you know what I would tell him?" "What?" Grace asked. "I would tell him to approach that scared girl in the church. I would tell him to offer her the ring and his name. I would tell him that the decision he is about to make will be the best one of his entire life, and he should not hesitate for even a moment. I would tell him that love comes in unexpected forms, and the strongest families are not always the ones that follow traditional paths." Grace turned to kiss him, pouring a quarter-century of love into the gesture. "And if I could go back to that desperate girl, I would tell her to have faith. I would tell her that redemption is real, that second chances exist, and that the whispers that seem so devastating will eventually fade to nothing. I would tell her that the handsome cowboy offering her salvation will become her truest friend, her greatest love, and the best decision she ever made." As the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them, Grace and Connor remained on their porch, two souls who had found each other in the midst of judgment and shame, and had built something pure and lasting. The whispers that had once threatened to destroy Grace had long since faded, replaced by the sounds that mattered. Children's laughter, the rhythm of honest work, the quiet conversations between two people who knew each other's hearts completely. Their story was not the traditional romance of dime novels and fairy tales. It had begun not with love at first sight, but with compassion and courage, with one man's decision to do what was right rather than what was easy. But over the years, that practical foundation had transformed into something transcendent. They had chosen each other every day, through hardships and triumphs, through the exhausting chaos of raising 6 children and the quieter joy of watching those children build their own lives. Grace thought about the woman she had been when she arrived in Delta, broken and shamed, carrying a child that represented her greatest mistake. She thought about how close she had come to being lost entirely, crushed under the weight of society's judgment. And then she thought about the simple gold band on her finger, worn thin over 25 years of wear, and the man who had placed it there with the simple words, "Wear mine and stop their whispers." He had not just given her a ring that day. He had given her dignity, safety, and a future. He had given her the space to heal and grow and become the woman she was always meant to be. And in return, she had given him a family, a purpose, and a love that would last all their days. Their children and grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had learned in this house. That kindness matters more than judgment. That family is built through choice and commitment as much as through blood. And that the strongest love is not the flashiest or most dramatic, but the steady, enduring kind that shows up every single day. As they finally rose to go inside, Connor paused to look out over the land they had tamed together. The ranch spread out before them in the moonlight, every fence post and building a testament to their shared labor and dreams. "We did good, did we not?" he said softly. Grace slipped her hand into his, their fingers interlocking with the ease of long practice. "We did better than good. We did extraordinary. We took a moment of desperation and turned it into a lifetime of love. We proved that endings can become beginnings and that shame can transform into triumph." Connor brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I would marry you again tomorrow if I could. I would live this life over 100 times. Only 100, Grace teased, her eyes dancing. "I would want at least 1,000 more lifetimes with you, Connor Fairbanks. 1,000 chances to build this beautiful life, to raise these wonderful children, to love you with everything I am." They walked into their home together, closing the door on another day, another year, another chapter in their remarkable love story. The whispers that had once seemed so devastating were forgotten, buried under years of proof that Grace Vaughn Fairbanks was so much more than the worst moment of her life. She was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a rancher, a businesswoman, and most importantly, a woman who had survived her darkest hour and emerged into the light. And Connor Fairbanks, the cowboy who had offered his ring to stop the whispers, had become far more than her rescuer. He was her partner in every sense of the word, the man who had stood beside her through every challenge and celebrated every triumph. He had loved her first daughter as his own, never once treating her as less than, and had built a family that would have made any man proud. Their story would be told for generations in Delta, not as a scandal but as an inspiration. It would be whispered not in judgment but in admiration, a reminder that the truest measure of a person is not where they start but where they finish, and that love can bloom in the most unexpected places when two people are brave enough to reach for it. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, passed down through children and grandchildren who would work the land and train the horses and tend the gardens. The house they built would shelter future generations, its walls holding the echoes of laughter and arguments, celebrations and quiet moments. And somewhere in the fabric of it all would be the memory of a scared young woman and a compassionate cowboy who looked past society's judgment to see each other's true worth. Grace and Connor lived for many more years, growing old together with the grace and dignity they had brought to everything else in their lives. They saw more grandchildren born, attended more weddings, and watched their children become the solid, successful people they had raised them to be. Catherine's children grew up hearing the story of their grandfather's kindness and their grandmother's courage, learning that love takes many forms and that family is what you make it. When Connor finally passed at the age of 72, peacefully in his sleep after a full day of work on the ranch he loved, Grace grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 47 years together, far more than that desperate young man and woman could have hoped for when he proposed on the hill overlooking the valley. She wore his ring until her own death 3 years later, never considering removing it, for it represented not just their marriage but the moment her life had changed forever. They were buried side by side in the family plot on the ranch, under the wide Colorado sky, surrounded by the land they had tamed and the legacy they had built. Their headstone was simple but perfect: Connor and Grace Fairbanks, beloved parents and grandparents together forever. And carved below, the words that Catherine had chosen, words that captured the essence of their remarkable story. Love builds family. The ranch continued to thrive, run by Samuel and his children, with regular visits from all the siblings and their growing families. On summer evenings, they would gather on the porch where Grace and Connor had spent so many hours, and someone would inevitably tell the story of how it all began. The details might blur with time, embellished or simplified depending on the teller, but the heart of it remained constant. A woman in need, a man with courage, and a love that proved stronger than shame or judgment or the cruel whispers of small minds. And every person who heard the story would understand that they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a legacy built not on perfection, but on choosing kindness when it mattered most, on standing firm when the easier path would be to walk away, and on believing that every person deserves a second chance at happiness, no matter what mistakes they may have made. The whispers that had once threatened to define Grace Vaughn had been silenced not by force, but by the simple, enduring power of a good life well lived. And the ring that Connor Fairbanks had offered her, that simple band of gold, had become not just a symbol of their marriage, but a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is offer grace to someone the world has condemned, and trust that love will find a way to bloom even in the harshest soil.